12 meters. The height of a four-story building. The distance between sand and sky. The measurement of one man's refusal to let his nation suffocate beneath the desert's weight. In November 2025, as the Harmattan winds sharpen their blades across the Sahel, preparing for another season of burial and erasure, something unprecedented rises from the earth of Burkina Faso. Not a monument, not a symbol, but a lifeline suspended in midair, 6 lanes of defiance stretching 186 kilometers across 7 provinces. They call it the Sahel Skyway, though its true name might be simpler: survival. President Ibrahim Traoré stands before the construction site, dust swirling around him like whispers of doubt from a watching world. His words cut through the wind. We do not beg the desert for mercy. We do not ask the sand for permission. We rise above it. Behind him, steel pillars pierce the horizon, each one a finger pointing toward a future that, until now, existed only in the dreams of those brave enough to imagine it. Stay with us. This is more than infrastructure. It is the heartbeat of a continent learning to breathe again. If this story moves something within you, show your support with a like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. These are not merely gestures. They are votes for dignity, for sovereignty, for the radical act of believing that nations can still transform themselves. What comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about what is possible when a people decide that enough is enough. For decades, the Sahel has been both home and prison to 30 million souls across Burkina Faso. Every year, between November and March, the Harmattan winds rise like an ancient army, carrying billions of tons of sand northward from the Sahara. But here is what the world never understood until now. This is not merely weather. This is economic suffocation measured in buried roads, lost harvests, and isolated communities watching their children grow up believing that remoteness is destiny. The numbers tell a story of quiet catastrophe. Between 2017 and 2023, more than 21,000 cargo shipments were delayed, damaged, or lost entirely to sand burial. Not delayed by hours, not by days, but by weeks that stretched into months, as entire sections of the national road network vanished beneath dunes that rose 40 to 90 centimeters in a single storm. Truck drivers speak of it like sailors describing the perfect storm, that moment when visibility drops to less than 30 meters, when the horizon disappears, when sand penetrates every seal, every gap, every attempt at protection. In the province of Oudalan, a trader named Musa once waited 17 days for medical supplies that should have taken 17 hours to arrive. His warehouse, if you could call the corrugated structure, that became a monument to impossibility. Fuel shipments that left Ouagadougou fresh became contaminated sludge by the time they reached Dori. Fresh produce from the south turned to rot before reaching northern markets. And in between these endpoints, entire communities learned to live with a special kind of poverty. The poverty of isolation, where abundance exists just beyond reach. Separated not by distance but by sand. $410 million. Every single year, this is what the desert steals from Burkina Faso's economy. But reducing it to numbers misses the human cost entirely. In Seno province, pregnant women have died because ambulances could not navigate the buried roads. In Yaga, children have gone blind from vitamin deficiencies because fresh food became a luxury that even money could not buy when the roads vanished. The desert does not simply cover roads. It covers possibilities. It buries futures before they can be born. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Ibrahim Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and determination. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. 7 provinces, Som, Oudalan, Yaga, Seno, Namentenga, Bam, and San Matenga, existed in a state of perpetual siege. Not from armies or conflicts, but from geography itself. The irony cuts deep. These are the provinces richest in minerals, in gold deposits, in the very resources that could transform the nation's economy. Yet they remained the poorest, their wealth trapped beneath sand, like ancient treasures waiting for an archaeology that never comes. Transport companies began refusing routes to the north. Insurance premiums tripled. The cost of basic goods in isolated provinces rose 300% above the national average. Families separated not by choice, but by the simple impossibility of travel. Young people fled southward, not seeking opportunity but fleeing imprisonment by sand. Entire communities aged without their children, withered without commerce, survived without truly living. The government tried everything conventional wisdom suggested. They built walls, the sand flowed over them. They planted trees, the desert consumed them. They laid new roads, the Harmattan laughed and buried them deeper. International consultants arrived with solutions designed for other places, other deserts, other kinds of problems. They left with the particular silence of experts who have discovered the limits of their expertise. By 2023, the situation had reached a breaking point. The old solutions had not simply failed, they had become monuments to failure, half-buried markers of attempts that the desert had conquered. Ministers presented reports filled with euphemisms, challenging conditions, infrastructure pressure, seasonal difficulties, as if naming the crisis gently might make it gentle. But in the villages, in the markets, in the spaces where real life unfolds, people had stopped believing that tomorrow could be different from today. It was into this moment of near surrender that a young military officer, who had taken leadership just months before, stood before a map of his nation, and made a decision that would either crown him with genius or bury him in ridicule. Ibrahim Traoré looked at the buried roads, at the economic hemorrhaging, at the geographic prison that held 7 provinces hostage, and spoke 5 words that changed everything. Then we rise above it. The desert had won every battle fought on its terms, in its domain, by its rules. So Burkina Faso would stop fighting the desert where it was strongest. They would take the battle to the sky. On the 12th of March, 2024, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before Parliament with blueprints that looked more like imagination than engineering. 186 kilometers of elevated highway, 6 lanes wide, 12 meters above the earth. 1,280 pillars of heat-resistant steel, each one engineered to withstand not just weight but war. The war against sand, wind, and temperatures that regularly exceed 48 degrees Celsius. The silence in the chamber was not skepticism, it was awe wrestling with disbelief. Here was a 36-year-old leader proposing to build what colonizers had called impossible, what development banks had deemed unfeasible, what even friends of Burkina Faso had gently suggested might be ambitious. The Sahel Skyway was not merely a road lifted into the air. It was a $3.2 billion gamble that the future was worth more than the comfort of accepting defeat. But here is what shocked the world more than the scale. 70% of the funding would come from within Burkina Faso itself. Not from loans that would chain generations to debt, not from partnerships that would lease sovereignty in exchange for asphalt, but from the radical reorganization of national priorities, from the mobilization of domestic industry, from the belief that a nation of 22 million people could pool their resources and their resolve to build their own salvation. The remaining 30% came from partners who understood they were investing not in a road but in a revolution. Russia provided steel technology adapted from their Siberian railways engineering that had learned to survive in the world's harshest conditions. China offered construction expertise from their elevated highways in Xinjiang province, where sandstorms had taught them similar lessons. Turkey contributed concrete technology that could withstand expansion and contraction in extreme temperature variations. These were not acts of charity but recognition. If Burkina Faso succeeded here, the entire Sahel region would never be the same. Each pillar was to be sunk 15 meters deep, anchored in bedrock that had existed since before the Sahara was a desert. The engineering specifications read like poetry written in mathematics. Wind resistance calculated for speeds up to 120 kilometers per hour, load-bearing capacity of 80 tons per lane. Expansion joints that could accommodate temperature swings of 40 degrees in a single day. The highway surface itself would use a composite material developed specifically for this project, part asphalt, part polymer, part prayer that chemistry could outsmart nature. Take a moment here to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your country, the corner of earth you call home. Africa. Breaking news sends you not just gratitude but a blessing, for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. Whether you watch from Lagos or London, from Cairo or Chicago, know that this story belongs to all who believe that dignity has no borders. The comments below become a map of solidarity, showing that Burkina Faso's courage resonates across continents. The construction plan divided the project into 47 segments, each one a milestone that could be celebrated or mourned. The first phase would connect Ouagadougou to Kaya, 62 kilometers that would serve as proof of concept. If they could build above the most wind-scarred corridor in the nation, they could build anywhere. Construction teams were not recruited. They were selected like astronauts for a mission where failure meant more than personal loss. It meant national humiliation broadcast to a watching world. The timeline was impossibly aggressive. 3 years from groundbreaking to the first vehicles crossing from end to end. Engineers from MIT who reviewed the plans called it theoretically achievable but practically unlikely. The French press, with their particular gift for condescension dressed as concern, ran headlines asking whether Burkina Faso was building a highway or a monument to hubris. But in the villages along the proposed route, something else was happening. Young men who had planned to migrate to Europe began enrolling in construction training programs. Women's cooperatives started preparing to feed thousands of workers. Children drew pictures of roads in the sky. By June 2025, the impossible had become routine. 70% of approach roads were complete, the earthbound connections that would feed traffic up to the Skyway. Supply chains that had been theoretical became physical. Steel from Tambao, cement from Ouagadougou, aggregate from quarries that had been dormant for decades. The National Steel Company, once written off as a colonial relic, found itself working 3 shifts to meet demand. The concrete plant in Bobo Dioulasso doubled its capacity in 6 months. This was not just construction, it was industrial resurrection. The pillars began rising in April, each one planted like a flag of determination. By October 2025, 920 of the 1,280 pillars stood complete. From the air, they looked like an army of giants marching single file across the desert, each one carrying the future on its shoulders. Drone footage went viral on social media not because of sophisticated marketing, but because the image itself was marketing. Africa building something the world had never seen. Work proceeded 24 hours a day. Night crews worked under floodlights that turned construction sites into islands of daylight in the darkness. The heat was so intense that steel tools had to be wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. Concrete had to be poured in the pre-dawn hours to prevent premature curing. Water for cooling and concrete mixing was trucked in from distances that added 30% to costs. Every challenge that arose seemed designed to make them quit. None did. By November 2025, construction had reached segment 41 of 47. The most difficult section, where the highway would curve around the Nakambe River basin while maintaining its elevation, was nearly complete. Engineers who had predicted failure were now studying the methods for their own projects. The African Development Bank, which had initially declined to participate, quietly sent observers to document techniques that might be applied elsewhere in the Sahel. But nature had been watching too, and it had prepared a response that no engineer had fully anticipated. December 2024 arrived, wearing the mask of catastrophe. For 19 consecutive days, the Harmattan unleashed itself with a fury that old men said they had not witnessed since the Great Drought of 1973. This was not wind. This was the earth trying to reclaim the sky. 62 kilometers per hour, sustained, with gusts that reached 90. The sand did not blow. It migrated. It invaded. It conquered with the patience of geological time compressed into human days. The construction sites became battlegrounds where visibility dropped to less than 30 meters. Workers tied themselves to pillars with rope to avoid being lost in the brown darkness that swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. The sand was not merely an obstacle. It was an entity with weight and will. It buried equipment worth millions. It infiltrated sealed containers. It turned precision machinery into monuments of rust and grit within hours. Then came the report that threatened to end everything. 1,140 newly installed pillars, nearly 90% of what had been built, were buried beneath sand dunes that had risen 1.8 meters in just 6 days. The mathematics of disaster were simple. $27 million in immediate damage, unknown millions in delays, and a timeline that suddenly looked like fantasy. International observers who had been documenting the project began drafting their narratives of noble failure. The images were devastating. Pillars meant to stand 12 meters tall were now visible only as steel fingertips reaching from sand graves. Construction vehicles designed to move earth were themselves moved by earth, pushed aside like toys by dunes that advanced 3 meters per day. The Segment 37 workspace, which had been a hive of coordinated activity, became an archaeological site where the remnants of ambition lay buried. In Ouagadougou, emergency meetings stretched through nights that felt like wakes. Ministers presented options that were not options but variations of surrender. Scale back the project, request international rescue, accept that perhaps the desert was meant to win. The French ambassador, with diplomatic delicacy, offered to coordinate European Union assistance to reassess the project's parameters. Code for managed retreat dressed as wisdom, but Ibrahim Traoré did something that transformed him from president to legend. Instead of convening politicians, he went to the construction sites. Not for photographs, not for speeches, but with a shovel. For 3 days, the president of Burkina Faso worked alongside construction crews, digging out pillars by hand, his military uniform exchanged for the simple cloth of a laborer, the image of him, face wrapped against the sand, shoulders bent to the work, became the recruitment poster that no marketing agency could have created. What happened next defied every prediction about human nature in crisis. Instead of workers abandoning the sites, more arrived. Volunteers from villages hundreds of kilometers away, students from the university engineering program, farmers who brought their own tools, women who organized water and food distribution that kept the human machinery running when the metal machinery failed. They came not because they were paid, but because they understood. If the Skyway died here, something in the national soul would die with it. The solution came from an unexpected source, not foreign consultants but local knowledge holders. Elders from the Mossy Kingdom remembered techniques their grandfathers had used to build compounds that survived similar storms. The answer was not to fight the sand, but to guide it. They created wind channels using temporary barriers that directed the sand flow around the pillars rather than against them. They mixed local materials, shea butter residue, actually with industrial coatings to create surfaces that sand could not grip. They scheduled work in windows the desert left open, those brief hours when the wind exhausted itself. Within 2 weeks, 800 of the buried pillars were excavated and reinforced. New installation methods were developed and real-time pillars were now installed in groups with protective barriers that would remain until multiple sections were connected. The cost was astronomical, the effort superhuman, but by January 2025, construction had not merely resumed but accelerated. Workers who had survived the 19-day storm carried themselves differently, walked with the particular confidence of those who had wrestled nature and refused to lose. The international engineering community watched in disbelief. The journal Structural Engineering International published a preliminary analysis titled Adaptive Construction Under Extreme Duress, the Burkina Faso model. MIT requested permission to send graduate students to study the modified techniques. The Russian engineering team, veterans of Siberian infrastructure, admitted they were learning methods they had not imagined. But it was the words of a worker named Amadou, broadcast on national radio, that captured what had really happened. The storm thought it was fighting a road. It did not understand it was fighting a people who had decided to be free. The Harmattan had thrown its worst at the Skyway and failed. But the world's reaction to that failure would prove even more dramatic than the storm itself. The shift in global perception happened not gradually but in the span of 3 headlines. First, the Wall Street Journal. The Sahel's impossible highway becomes improbably real. Then, Engineering News Record. Burkina Faso rewrites the rules of desert construction. Finally, The Economist. Rising above. How West Africa's poorest nation is building its richest future. The world that had been preparing obituaries for the Sahel Skyway found itself instead writing birth announcements. In Washington, the State Department quietly revised its infrastructure assessment for West Africa. The single line that mattered: Burkina Faso has demonstrated indigenous engineering capacity exceeding previous estimates. Behind those bureaucratic words lay a recognition that rattled assumptions about African capability, about who could build what, about where innovation truly lived. The Pentagon requested detailed analysis of the logistics networks that had maintained construction through the Harmattan storms, not for development purposes but for military applications in similar environments. Mali's government sent a delegation that was supposed to observe for 3 days. They stayed 3 weeks. Niger's Minister of Infrastructure arrived skeptical and left with preliminary agreements for knowledge transfer. Senegal, which had its own coastal highway challenges, began studying whether elevation might solve problems they had been throwing seawalls at for decades. The African Union, often criticized for ceremonial responses to concrete challenges, established a working group to document what they called the Burkina model for continental application. But it was the private sector response that truly measured the transformation. Insurance companies that had refused to cover Sahelian infrastructure projects began revising their risk assessments. A consortium of European logistics firms started redesigning their West African networks around the assumption that the Skyway would be operational. Chinese mining companies, which had written off certain Burkinabe deposits as inaccessible, began negotiating extraction rights. The highway had not yet carried a single commercial vehicle, but it was already restructuring the economic geography of the region. Critics remained, of course. They always do, when the impossible becomes merely difficult. French economists calculated that maintenance costs would consume 17% of the national budget. German engineers worried about metal fatigue and extreme temperature cycling. American political analysts questioned whether a military government could sustain such civilian infrastructure development. These were not unreasonable concerns. They were the reasonable concerns of those who had not stood in the Harmattan winds, who had not watched a president dig alongside laborers, who had not seen a nation choose transformation over resignation. Social media told a different story. Videos of construction progress gained millions of views not through algorithmic manipulation but through organic sharing. Comment sections, usually sewers of negativity, filled with something rarer than gold, hope. Engineers from India shared similar challenges from the Thar Desert. Brazilian construction workers recognized the improvisation from favela building. Indonesians saw echoes of their tsunami-resistant structures. The Sahel Skyway had become, without intending to, a global symbol of ingenious adaptation. The BBC sent a crew to document what they expected would be a story of ambitious failure. They left with footage that their own editors initially questioned as too positive for balanced coverage. CNN's infrastructure correspondent, veteran of 1,000 development disappointments, stood on a completed section of the Skyway and admitted on camera, "I have covered promises and failures across Africa for 2 decades. This is neither. This is something new." By August 2025, international engineering firms were not offering help but requesting partnerships. They wanted to learn, not teach. The knowledge flow that had always moved north to south had reversed, if only in this narrow channel, if only for this moment. But moments, as Ibrahim Traoré had proven, could be enough to change everything. Then, in September 2025, something happened that transformed the Sahel Skyway from an engineering achievement into something far more significant. It came not from any foreign capital or international organization, but from a cramped laboratory at Ouagadougou Polytechnic, where young engineers had been working on a problem everyone else had considered solved. The laboratory at Ouagadougou Polytechnic was not where revolutions typically began. Cramped, underfunded, equipped with machinery that belonged in museums rather than research facilities. But the 12 engineers working there, average age 28, all born within 50 kilometers of the capital, understood something that billion-dollar research centers had missed. They understood heat not as data but as lived experience, sand not as particles but as an enemy they had fought since childhood. Their breakthrough came with the poetry of accidents that marks true discovery. They were not trying to revolutionize infrastructure. They were trying to solve a specific problem with pillar joint expansion in segment 39. But what emerged from their work would reshape the entire project and announce Burkina Faso's arrival as an innovation source rather than recipient. They called it TR12, coding the TR standing for thermal resistance, though some insisted it meant Traoré's revolution. The innovation was elegantly simple, which is to say it was monumentally complex, made to look effortless. By combining locally sourced kaolin clay with imported titanium dioxide and a binding agent derived from shea processing waste, they created a coating that reflected 72% of direct solar radiation. In the brutal honesty of Sahel sunshine, this meant surface temperatures dropped by 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. 6 to 8 degrees. In engineering terms, this meant metal fatigue reduced by 40%. In economic terms, it meant maintenance cycles extended from 5 years to 7. In human terms, it meant workers could touch the pillars at midday without burning their hands. In symbolic terms, it meant Burkina Faso was not merely consuming technology but creating it, not merely solving its own problems but developing solutions the world needed. Within weeks, the validation came flooding in. The journal Materials Science and Engineering published a fast-track peer review. South Korean industrial giants requested samples. The University of Cairo announced they would redesign their desert construction curriculum around the TR12 principles. But most significantly, 3 neighboring nations, Mali, Niger, and Chad, formally requested licensing agreements. For the first time in modern history, Sahelian nations were negotiating to buy technology from each other rather than from former colonizers. President Ibrahim Traoré visited the Polytechnic laboratory on a humid September evening. No cameras, no ceremony, just a leader meeting the minds that had transformed his vision from ambitious to achievable. His words to them were not preserved in official records but in memory. "You have proven that innovation does not require permission from those who claim to own the future. You have taken our heat, our struggle, our limitation, and transformed it into our advantage." The ripple effects were immediate and undeniable. International firms that had positioned themselves as essential technical advisors found themselves requesting joint ventures instead. The narrative shifted from, "Can Burkina Faso finish this project?" to, "What will Burkina Faso build next?" Young engineers across West Africa began choosing Ouagadougou Polytechnic over European universities. The brain drain that had hemorrhaged talent for decades began, tentatively, to reverse. The Sahel Skyway was no longer just a road. It had become a declaration that the future of African infrastructure would be written by African hands, solving African challenges with African innovation. The desert had been the teacher, necessity the curriculum, and determination the only graduation requirement. Before we close this chapter of Africa's emerging story, let us pause at the threshold of tomorrow. What you have witnessed today is not merely the chronicle of concrete and steel, but the architecture of audacity itself. If this journey through Burkina Faso's transformation has stirred something within you, that ancient recognition that humans are capable of impossible things, then subscribe to this channel. Not as a gesture of support for us, but as an alliance with every African nation that refuses to accept the limitations others have drawn around their dreams. Your subscription is a vote for stories untold, for innovations unborn, for the revolutionary idea that Africa's future will be authored by Africans. Join us, because what comes next will not simply continue this narrative. It will explode every assumption about what a determined people can achieve. As November 2025 draws to its close, long shadows fall beneath the Sahel Skyway. These are not the shadows of doubt that once darkened Burkina Faso's future, but shadows cast by pillars of possibility, by 6 lanes of elevated determination that prove the desert can be defeated by those who refuse to fight on its terms. Test convoys now glide 12 meters above sand that once swallowed hope. Trucks carrying manganese, cotton, and gold traverse in hours what once took days or never arrived at all. In the villages along the route, children who grew up believing isolation was inheritance now watch lights move across the evening sky, not stars but headlights, not dreams but deliveries. Families separated by sand for generations plan reunions. Markets that survived on memory of abundance now stock fresh produce. The economic projections, those careful calculations that predicted recovery in decades, are being revised to years. Ibrahim Traoré's gamble has become Burkina Faso's glory. The Sahel Skyway stands as more than infrastructure. It stands as insurrection against impossibility. Every pillar planted in the desert floor is a flag of sovereignty. Every meter of elevated road is a declaration that Africa will no longer wait for permission to be magnificent. The hands that built this skyway, calloused by heat, carved by sand, hardened by determination, are the same hands now writing engineering textbooks that will teach the world. Ibrahim Traoré once said, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise and we claim it." The Sahel Skyway is that claim made physical, that rise made literal. It is the future refusing to wait its turn, dignity demanding its due, and a people discovering that the sky was never the limit, it was always the beginning.